Hello, I'm Nancy Conroy. I'm the author of From Derry to the Pontiac. This is a book I published last year, and it's about my dales of Clarendon Township, Pontiac County, Quebec. And it basically tells the story of how my dales journeyed to the Canadas from Northern Ireland and helped to found the village of Shawville, Quebec. I've done a number of presentations based on the book, and a lot of people aren't able to actually come to the physical presentation, but have asked if they could see the presentation. So I've produced this video, and I'm going to produce a few more that will allow you to both see the PowerPoint presentation and also follow along with my commentary. This particular presentation is about the Irish end of the story, which is where the story begins. And I'm going to now proceed through the PowerPoint. As I mentioned, my dales came from settled in Clarendon Township, and I was born in that township in 1948. And in 2015, I decided that I really wanted to learn more about my dales, research the genealogy, but also learn about their stories coming from Northern Ireland to the Canadas in the 1820s. I was very lucky because one of the big clues I had, and you'll appreciate this if you do genealogy, is that in the Shawville Village Cemetery, there is a tombstone for my great-great-great-grandfather, John Dale Sr., and his wife, Elizabeth Wilson. And you may find it a little hard to read, but on this tombstone, it says natives of County Derry, Ireland. And as you know, if you do genealogy, it's very helpful if you know where your ancestors came from. So in my case, this was a very important starting point. When I began the process in 2015, I didn't really know very much about my dales, even though I was born in Shawville, Quebec, in Clarendon Township. My father, his father were both born there, but I didn't really know much about their actual history and how far back it went. Luckily, at the beginning of my process, though, I discovered that I had three cousins, Ron Dale and his two sisters, Lynn and Val, who had done a lot of research on our dales. And so they very kindly shared with me a rather extensive database. And that database saved me a huge amount of time and effort in terms of tracking down information about my dales. However, in doing their research, they informed me that they couldn't really find any hard data about John Dale Sr., his marriage to Elizabeth Wilson in County Derry. He couldn't find birth data on the two sons, John Jr. and William, or on their relative, Edward. And yet these five individuals did come to the Canadas together, and we really wanted to know for sure to document their birth dates and the marriage of my ancestor. Something else we didn't really know for sure was where John Dale Sr. and his family lived while they were in County Derry, and that was something that I decided I wanted to try to discover. One of the other things we didn't appreciate fully at the time, we did have theories about it, but there was a couple who came to Clarendon about 10 years after my ancestors, Richard Wilson and his wife, Mary Dale. We had a theory that they were related, one or the other, to our family, but we weren't sure about that, and I wanted to learn more about them. The other thing I didn't know, although my cousins informed me pretty early on, was that my Dales were not what we normally think of as being Irish, although I've been told that all my life. They were actually what is referred to as Ulster Scots, but I'll talk about that later. So, beginning in County Derry, another very lucky event that occurred was I discovered a website, a public free website that was produced and maintained by a man called Bill McAfee. You'll see that the URL is here at the bottom. He has put together this amazing site, and in it, he's included several databases that are based on either censuses or surveys that were done by the English government back in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s. Now, these databases don't necessarily cover all of the counties in Ulster. We're talking now about those very early years. But in these databases, he has alphabetized them. And so I was able to go back starting in 1630, which seemed amazing. The 1630 muster rolls for Antrim and Derry included 5 dales. You'll notice in my heading, I point out that in fact the original spelling was D-E-A-L as opposed to D-A-L-E. But because the family originated in Scotland, the pronunciation would have been the way we say Dale now. So in that 1630 muster rolls, there were 5 Deals. In the 1669 Hearth money rolls, there were 3 Dales in Antrim, but there didn't appear to be Dales at that point in Derry. However, by 1740, not 100 years later, but quite a long time later, there was a Protestant householder return. And now again, we found a couple of Dales in Antrim and 5 Dales in Derry. The most important census for me, because my ancestor, John Dale Sr., was probably born around in the 1770s, there was a 1766 religious census, and I was quite keen to look at that. I did discover in that census 5 Dales in Derry, and because we knew that my ancestor came from Derry, that's what we focused on. There was a James, a Thomas, and another Thomas in a little market town called Marafelt, one of them, and 2 of them were in Ballymulderg, which is just south of Marafelt. There were also 2 Dales in Connaught, but I'm going to talk about why we don't think that they were connected to us. Lastly, not as important a census, but there was a 1796 flax grower census, which he included in his database, and one of those was a Dale in Derry. He was a flax grower. So I highly recommend that site if you're doing any research in either Derry or Antrim or a few of the other Ulster counties. You might find some very good information. Second part of this story that was really helpful to me in doing my research, my cousin Ron, whom I mentioned before, he had his DNA done on several different sites, Ancestry, 23andMe, and a couple of others. And through his DNA testing, which probably took place 15 or 20 years ago, he discovered that we were in fact linked genetically to the Dales of Marafelt and Ballymulderg. Much more recently, I had my DNA results done, and again, they proved very helpful in identifying the fact that the Richard Wilson and Mary Dale I spoke about earlier were actually related to me. I have a match with a man who descends from them, and it essentially allowed us to conclude that in fact either Richard was a possible brother of my great-great-great-grandmother Elizabeth Wilson, or Mary Dale, his wife, was connected to my great-great-great-grandfather John Dale Sr. So where do the Dales live in County Derry? I thought I would include a map here for people who aren't overly familiar with Ulster and what it looks like. Now this is actually a map of Northern Ireland, and it doesn't include, there's 3 counties that were part of Ulster that did not end up being part of Northern Ireland, but you can see County Antrim. The County Londonderry is what I refer to as County Derry. Apparently it's a kind of a political issue. If you're an English person, you tend to call it Londonderry, and if you're a person who was born and raised on the island of Ireland, you would call it County Derry. You'll notice there's a lake, great big lake here, Loch Nay, and it partly borders County Derry in the southeast. This map is a blow-up, and this is a really important map for me and for anyone who's interested in the origins of the Dales, because there's the town of Marafelt, and this here is Ballymulderg. The other county or townland that's going to be important is this townland, which is called Ballyneal, and it's important in terms of Richard Wilson and his family. A few years into my research project, my husband and I took a trip to Northern Ireland. My cousin Ron and his sisters had already visited before. They, in fact, had tracked down, because of the DNA matches that Ron had discovered, they tracked down some relatives who still live in Northern Ireland. And so we based ourselves in Ballymulderg, just south of Marafelt, and the owner of the B&B brought out this map one day to show me. And this is part of a much larger map of the area, but this is part of Ballymulderg, and we stayed at a B&B that was over here in that upper left corner. He took us very kindly on a morning tour, and you'll notice over here there's a hill called Deal's Hill. Of course, they would have pronounced it Dale's Hill, and because he knew the farmer that owned the land, he was able to walk us up to the top of the hill, and this is a picture of me. You get a sense of the landscape of the area, which actually looks quite a lot like Clarendon Township here in Quebec. It was wonderful to actually stand up here to see the landscape and to think that perhaps from somewhere in this area our Dales had come. I might mention that over here there was a lot in one of the databases I found that included a map that showed that there was a Dale living on property over here until certainly in 1850, but I'm not sure how much longer they were there. I thought I'd like to show you the people that I met when I was there. This was very, very exciting and a highlight really of the trip. Over here, we're having lunch. We're going to have lunch with Nan here and Louise and myself in their home. And I thought this was quite a coincidence because my name is Nancy Louise. This is Louise, this is Nan. And so it seemed quite amazing that we shared these names. They were very hospitable. Nan took us on a tour around the area. This is where they grew up, probably in the early 1900s, I guess. A rather old building. I think it actually housed the family as well as probably some of the livestock. But she took us on this lovely tour and then showed us a mill, which was in her family. One of her early ancestors, Thomas Dale, had owned a mill, and I believe this mill was on the spot where the original mill existed. Then we were very fortunate to meet a bachelor distant cousin, Frank Dale. He was in it. They were all in their 80s. We met him at his farm. He was an amazing character. He was extremely witty, extremely welcoming. He and a couple of his younger cousins out to lunch. And he gave me some pictures, which I thought were lovely. This is a picture of his grandfather, James, and a picture of his father, John. So all in all, it was wonderful to be able to talk with and learn from people that were actually connected to us. I have to say, though, that in doing my research and on this trip, there were some disappointments. Before going on the trip, I'd been in touch with 4 churches in the vicinity of Marafelt and Ballymulderg. And 3 of the churches were able to get back to me. One of them said they had no records left, original records left of births and marriages. But 2 of the other churches did provide me with some information. And when we visited Ireland, they both invited us to come and meet with them. The meetings were very pleasant, but didn't really produce any real data on births or marriages related to our Dales. However, I did spend 2 days at the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland in Belfast. Highly recommend a visit to that archive if you have any possibility of having ancestors up in the north. Spent quite a bit of time going through microfilm. They did have records from a number of the churches. In my book, I actually list the dates and the information available with respect to which churches had data for which years. I should mention in my book, I actually provide quite a lot of the sources of information and the places where I did my research for others who might want to do similar work. My meetings with Nan, Louise, and Frank were wonderful from a personal point of view, but none of them seemed to know too much. Particularly Nan and Louise didn't know too much about their history. Frank knew a little bit more, but I had hoped there might be greater detail available, and I was really hoping that one or the other might be able to give us better clues to who our John Dale Sr. was. They didn't seem to know. We did spend a little bit of time at the National Archives of Ireland in Dublin. What's important there to know is that most of the records related to Ulster are now in Prony. They've been transferred there. However, I understand that you can still find information about your ancestors, even if they lived in the north, at that archive, and certainly Dublin itself is worth a visit. I also paid for memberships in Roots Ireland and the Ulster Historical Foundation. In neither case could I find any really solid records to help us nail down that original genealogical information. However, at Prony, there was some good news. First of all, I discovered, the little document on the left is the Protestant census of the parish of the Chapel of the Woods. And this is a church very close to where my Dales probably came from. I guess I didn't find them in this document, but this document is recorded by townland, by individual. It gives information about whether they have a wife, whether they have children, whether they have servants. So I wanted to include this for the benefit of any of you watching, to let you know that it isn't just major censuses that you might want to refer to. It appears that from time to time the individual churches did censuses. And so this document, I loved holding this little document in my hand. It's not digitized as far as I know at Prony. And so it was really wonderful to be able to hold a document from 1829 that had all this incredibly useful genealogical information, maybe not for me, but perhaps for someone else. However, on the other hand, I came across a record of 4 rent roll documents. They're called Rent Roll of Salter's Estate for 1 year ending November 1814. I mentioned first that in the 1600s and the 1700s, the English government encouraged a lot of Scottish settlers to take over lands on a lease basis from Catholics who'd been removed from their land. Most of these lands had been allocated to noblemen, or in this case, to a guild, a London guild, the Salters Guild. So this Salter's estate included many townlands in the area of Marafelt and Ballymuldirbeg. There were 4 of them, 1814, this is the first, 1818, 1825, and 1828. I have to tell you, I was very excited when I found these rent rolls, because when I looked at the first one, if you look over here, there's a James Dale and a John Dale in Ballymuldirbeg, so it confirms there were Dales there at that time. There's also a Thomas Dale here at the bottom. And so because of the John Dale entry, I thought maybe that is my John Dale. However, good news didn't really continue in relation to the Dales, because as I looked at 1818, John was there. But by 1825, my John Dale had left and come to the Canadas. Unfortunately, in 1825 and 1828, James, John, and Thomas are still there. So that was disappointing, but by the same token, these documents were original documents, not digitized, not available online, and just being aware that this kind of data is out there was very encouraging. But I want to talk now about Richard Wilson and Mary Dale. I've mentioned them a couple of times. We do believe, and through DNA, we know there's a genetic connection between them and my Dales. We already knew before that Mary Dale, there's a record of her baptism in the First Marafelt Presbyterian Church. She was baptized in 1780, and her father was a James Dale. 3 of their children were baptized at Chapel of the Woods, and we have records for that. And it identifies in those baptismal records that Richard Wilson and Mary Dale of Ballyneal townland were the parents. So in the rent rolls, this is what was so exciting to me. In 1814 and 1818, there was a Richard Wilson farming on a 20-acre leased farm, which, by the way, was a large-sized leased farm in Ballyneal. So it placed this family, Richard Wilson and Mary Dale, very close to where we believe our Dales came from. I mentioned that Robert Brown, our B&B host, had taken us on a tour, and here's a picture on Wilson land. If you look up at that photo, that's Dales Hill up there. These buildings are over here, and it's still in Wilson hands, this farm. I like to think that possibly John Dale lived up the other side of the hill, Elizabeth lived on this side of the hill, and the young man who took us on a tour of the grounds very graciously allowed us to walk around. This laneway will take you up to Dales Hill. I like to think that Elizabeth Wilson, my great-great-great-grandmother, and John Dale Sr., my great-great-great-grandfather, may have met up here at some point. Perhaps that's how they met and ended up marrying. So based on this trip, I learned a great deal about Ulster itself, the history of Ulster. I had found some interesting and in some cases surprising information. First of all, I did do a lot of research on the plantation of Ireland, which is how they refer to all of these Scots settlers who were brought over to the north of Ireland, or Ulster, I should say, back in the day, that's what it was called. And they were allowed to lease these farms from the estate agents that I mentioned before. And what was most interesting to me about this part of the story is that at the time, most of these Scotsmen were Presbyterians. From the English perspective, If you converted to the Church of Ireland, which was Anglican, you got all the privileges of an Englishman who was Anglican. But if you didn't convert from Presbyterianism to becoming Anglican, you had lesser privileges. Now, mind you, the Ulster Scots who settled there had more privileges than the Catholics, who were treated very badly during this period. I also did work on what it meant to be a lease farmer, and discovered something I found quite surprising and quite progressive for the time. But back at that time, if you had a farm lease, which really was a rental of your property, you could sell your lease, and I expect that that's what John Dale Sr. did. If he was living there in Ballymaldergbeig on a small leased farm, when he decided to come to the Canadas, he probably was able to acquire some money to transfer his lease to someone else. That seemed like a fairly progressive law to me. Now, the other thing I found interesting was because I mentioned that if you stayed a Presbyterian and you were an Ulster Scot, you didn't always feel all that loyal to the English, even though the English brought you over because they saw you as being loyal. There was a rebellion in 1798 in Ulster, and some Ulster Scots actually joined with the Catholics to fight against the English because they wanted greater autonomy and greater say in what was going on at the government level. Something else I came across, I believe it was in a copy of the, I think it was called the Ordnance Survey Memoirs for this area, for Derry. I discovered that throughout this area where my ancestors came from, there were Sunday schools, they named them all, and in these Sunday schools, the ability to attend was essentially non-denominational. So it also even identifies the number of children who were Protestant or Catholic who attended certain schools, Sunday schools. And I found myself thinking that my view about Ulster and Northern Ireland and the Troubles was very black and white. And in fact, at the time, it wasn't that all Catholics and all Protestants hated each other. Sometimes they actually did cooperate. I found that quite an important learning for me. This is an image of a place we stayed. I highly recommend it. It's called the Bothy. It's in a little town called Ruski, not that close to Ballymaldergbeig, but it was out in the country, and this was a view out our back window. We stayed in the Bothy is really a little barn, two-story barn converted into a lovely Airbnb, and we had wonderful hikes down into the valley below. And during the day, as you sat with your cup of tea or coffee, you could hear these sheep baaing in the background. It was very, very tranquil and lovely. Well, that's the end of my presentation on the research I did in Northern Ireland. I hope it was helpful to anyone watching the video. I thought I should identify here, at least for you, where you might purchase a copy of my book. Now, the book obviously goes way beyond talking about their life in Ulster. It tracks their journey across the Atlantic, up the St. Lawrence, up the Grand River, now called the Ottawa. We believe they stopped in Goulburn for a time, and then eventually worked their way up the Ottawa River and chose to settle in the wilderness as squatters in Clarendon Township. It then traces their lives there all the way through to the late 1800s. So the book is both genealogical and also historical, and documents both the history of my family and the history of the area. I've also included a link to my website where there's more information perhaps for you about the book. I hope the presentation was helpful. I hope you found it useful and interesting. And I should just note that I will be producing a couple of more videos, one about the very early years in Shawville, or in Clarendon Township, 1821 to 1827. And I have another presentation which I'll be producing as a video that's about what the Clarendon Centre, the name of the little village that emerged in the center of Clarendon, what it looked like just before it became a formal municipality called Shawville. Thank you very much for your attention.